Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. Larry Dasilva, your host. Thanks for joining us. I always love to talk history, and at first I thought, well, we're going to have a nice sports book to talk about. But then as I got to really delve into this book and our guest today joining us here on the program, I realized that it was a much more complex than just the sports world and the Boston Red Sox of yesteryear. Our guest is Skip Desjardin. And Skip actually is not a Connecticut native, I don't believe, but he's close enough. He lives in the state right now, and he is joining us. And to go back to the book, over 100 years ago, September of 1918 to be exact, three things came to Boston, not necessarily in this order: war, the plague, and the World Series. And here to sort these things out, our guest today, Skip Desjardin. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, with any author, we invariably start with the question, fact or fiction? In this case, fact. Where did the idea for the book come from?
Yeah, I am a big fan of the novelist Dennis Lehane, who's a Boston guy and has written a number of best-selling books, many of which have been made into big-time movies. He wrote Gone Baby Gone. He wrote Mystic River. A lot of books that folks would be familiar with. And he also wrote a book that was set in 1919 in Boston called The Given Day. And one of the key characters of that book was Babe Ruth. Not the fat, pigeon-toed Babe Ruth that we think of from newsreels, sort of running around the bases in fast motion.
Skip's very subtle, you know.
This was 23-year-old, in his prime, incredibly great athlete, Babe Ruth. And that character really captured my attention. In part of this book, one of the things they refer to quite a bit was the previous year in 1918 when the World Series had been played in September, and they also referenced the Spanish flu. So my head started to churn and I wondered, well, A, why was the World Series being played in September? It's always October.
Which I didn't know until I read your book. So there you go. And I'm a big baseball fan.
And I hadn't realized it either. So that started me wondering. And the second one was, if they were playing the World Series while the Spanish flu was raging in Boston, why would anybody go out to Fenway Park for a ball game at exactly the same time that going to Fenway Park could literally kill you?
Yes, not the game, but the after
But being in that crowd.
Exactly.
And so I started to look those things up just for my own education. And once I did, I started to stumble upon all the other things that were going on in Boston in that single 30-day period when, for once, Boston lived up to its nickname as the hub of the universe. It seemed that everything that was going on in America and the world had some connection to Boston.
Indeed. We've got a shot here just to give folks, I knew it, but I didn't know the complexity or the extent of this. 1903, 1904, 1912, 1915, 16, and 18. Most of those years, I guess the ones in red, the other ones would be pennants or maybe lost in the World Series. But again, I think it was, 4 in 14 or 15 years, world champs.
Yeah, people forget, especially with the long period of my youth and the struggles that the Red Sox had, which was that they were the most dominant team in baseball in this period of time. They were baseball's first big dynasty early in the 20th century. And as you said, they've got all these banners hanging at Fenway Park because they won year after year after year. Of course, a year after the events in this book, the Red Sox sell Babe Ruth to the Yankees, and history takes a very ugly turn.
The curse of the Bambino begins.
Yes.
Yeah. And here's a shot of Fenway Park circa around 1918, just to give you an idea, maybe a little, I don't know, paint or whatever polish that you can do on brick or mortar or stone, whatever. But again, there's a shot of the same ballpark, which is amazing, and it's a great thing to see, like Wrigley Field, because there are really, those are the first two that come to mind that are really purely almost the way they were back then. Yankee Stadium's been through, unfortunately, now a change. It was renovated back in the mid-'70s, whatever. They got a lot of mileage out of it, but here's an example of one that has, despite all the things about luxury boxes and everything else, has withstood the test of time.
Yeah, if you go to Fenway Park for a Red Sox game today, the exterior on Jersey Street looks just like that.
There you go. Now, just to give you a little bit of perspective in terms of what was going on at that time, Woodrow Wilson was president. Sunday baseball was banned in most cities. I knew that many years ago, but I'd forgotten that. The Yankees still played at the Polo Grounds. Okay, they weren't even in the house that Ruth built. Okay, so you'll see that later on. Young Babe Ruth was a 23-year-old pitcher for the Sox with a very good bat and productivity. As we discussed, 4 out of the first 15 years of the 20th century, the World Series champs were the Red Sox, and then look what happened. So we fast forward to not too distant history, 2018, and here we got the Red Sox. Let me see if I got my math right. 2004, 2007, 2013, and 2018. Not bad, but when you consider it up against the flags you saw there, that really is quite impressive. Quite impressive. Now, here's a question I don't remember in the book. To digress a minute, they were not all for the same manager?
No.
No.
As a matter of fact, the manager of the Red Sox in 1918 was the first year that he had been, that he was the manager. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's always amazes me how a first-year manager can just come in, and the same thing with the 2018 comes in, and all of a sudden, wow, look what happened. Why they got rid of Farrell? That's for another show. Okay, but that's just
I'll come back.
That's just one man's opinion. And speaking of our president in those days, there's Woodrow Wilson, and we'll talk a little bit about him and another gentleman who later went on to become president. Let's talk about something that chapters you deal with in the book, a thing called work or fight. And talk about what was being proposed there.
Yeah, it turned out that was the answer to my question about why the World Series was being played in September instead of October. When Woodrow Wilson won re-election in 1916, he did it on a campaign slogan of he kept us out of war. He gets inaugurated in March of 1917, and within 6 weeks declares war. And so he knows he now has to turn the whole country around. We were not prepared for a war. The United States really had no standing army. We didn't have the manufacturing base ready to start turning out guns and bullets and tanks and ships. So he had to turn the whole country on a dime from we don't want to be in the war to we have to be in the war and we have to win. So part of what they realized was they needed to raise an army quickly. So in May of 2018, the government issued what became known as the Work or Fight Order that said every man between the ages of 21 and 30 in America had 3 choices. 1, enlist. 2, make yourself available for the draft. Or 3, get a job in a war-related industry. Not just any job. You can't just be down at the store selling shoes. You've got to be in a factory making shoes.
Not the dugout.
that the troops can wear.
Yeah.
And that rule was ready to go into effect in July, but the question was, would baseball players be affected? The government had said that theater workers, for instance, were not subject to the work or fight rule because entertainment was important for morale for civilians. But they hadn't exempted baseball players. And baseball players were certainly between 21 and 30, and they were certainly in good physical shape. And there was a lot of pressure for those baseball players to serve in some way. After all, who wants to send their son or their brother or their father off to war to fight and die in Europe when these guys are sitting here getting paid way more than the average person in America made to play a game? Baseball and the government reached a compromise that said the season can run through Labor Day, and then the 2 American and National League champs get 2 more weeks to play the World Series. But after Labor Day, all other teams' players have to meet one of these three criteria. And after the World Series, even the Red Sox and, as it turned out, the Chicago Cubs, their players have to meet these three criteria.
So there was a possibility, had the war, like World War II later on, been prolonged, and again, it was handled differently in World War II, but obviously that was a much longer battle. We didn't get in until April of 17. Was there a plan, the impression I get from reading the book, that there might not have been baseball in 1919?
It was very much in question, yeah. And the plan was, at the end of this World Series in 1918, baseball would shut down, and it would not come back until the war was over. Whether that was 2 years or 3 years or however long it would be. Now, at the time, nobody realized it would be 8 weeks.
Yeah.
But baseball was going away. And depending on how things went in the war and what the economy was like after the war, and whether people still had money to buy tickets, there were a lot of questions as to whether it would ever come back.
And that was, of course, before all this other stuff that we're going to get into.
Yeah.
And we lost that, but here's a shot here. Again, these are the old Washington Senators, but I'll just read you that. Emulating U.S. military servicemen, the Senators march in step before a game. Such patriotism didn't go far enough in the eyes of the U.S. government, which felt that major league owners and players weren't sacrificing enough for the war effort. So there you go. Again, that whole sentiment that was going on, which, as I said, didn't occur, at least to my knowledge, in World War II. A lot of the stars either got drafted or many of them volunteered long before, like Ted Williams, of course, who, for those who don't know, served not only beyond admirably in both World War II and Korea. And again, that's for another show, but the amount of years and numbers that he lost, that's mind-boggling,
yeah.
and you could do a whole show just on that. We had a shot earlier before the World War I started in 1914. Help me out here. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
And then, of course, next thing you know, you got Turkey and you got all these other countries, starting a warfare. And we were going through a period where a lot of isolationism.
We absolutely were, and that's why Wilson managed to win re-election by keeping us out of war, because the sentiment in the country was very much against getting involved. People thought Europe has been fighting wars amongst themselves for hundreds of years. They're just at it again. What does that have to do with us? But as Germany had some success, the United States started to understand that there was more on the line than we had early on realized. And Wilson made the decision, especially after the sinking of the Lusitania, when German submarines started to destroy U.S. ships going back and forth to Europe, that this was going to grow into something more than what had been the case in the past with European wars.
To digress a minute, is it me, or it seems like, now here's a period you bring up that, again, a lot of us don't know fully all these things that went on. Of course, then in the 30s, another thing, plus we're battling the Depression, all the way fast forward even to now in the 21st century, there always seems to be this thing of kind of different degrees of isolationism. And it's kind of like I look at the way things are now. I can't speak for back then, but it's like, as the world leader, or one of a few world leaders, you just can't crawl under a rock and just ignore what's going on. But we always seem to make the same mistake, and then again, that helps others who maybe don't have the same, worldly ideas. They have worldly ideas, but they're not necessarily good ideas to, stir up problems, and then wars come of it.
Yeah, and one of the most vocal proponents of that approach was Henry Cabot Lodge. Another one of those connections to Boston and Massachusetts that takes place in this month. Lodge was what we would now call the Senate Majority Leader. He was the top Republican on Capitol Hill, while Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat as president. And he had for years, along with Theodore Roosevelt, been a strong advocate of what they called war preparedness, which is bolster our defense, spend more money, build an army, build a fleet of ships. As Ronald Reagan said years later, in borrowing one of Lodge's sentiments, which was that the best way to defend America is to be ready to go on the offense. So here was Lodge sort of arguing from 1914 through 1918, hey, we need to get into this war, we need to be prepared to fight it, to defend this country. All of a sudden, Wilson turns on a dime and says, yeah, you know what, you're right, we do need to get into this war. And Lodge found himself in kind of an odd political situation in which he's got an obligation to support a Democrat wartime president, but still feels that long-term partisan Republican need to be the opposition.
And I got the impression that they, at least Lodge, didn't like him at all.
No, they didn't like each other at all. And
we're trying to be subtle here, folks.
Maybe not all that different than these days. So what Lodge decided to do was, look, I will support the war, but I will take every opportunity that I see to criticize the way we're conducting the war. And that's how he straddled the line.
You talk a little bit in the book about airplanes became such a dominant force. Obviously, you can go back to the Civil War, Spanish-American War, to a much lesser extent. Of course, the airplane wasn't around then, and it became such a dominant force in the World War I warfare. So that changed the whole perspective of how battles were fought and whatever. And then, of course, for those who know anything about World War I, a lot of trenches.
Yeah.
You didn't see that as much, if at all, during World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, et cetera. But that was, again, it's just craziness. And the amount of people that were lost, thank goodness. I always wondered, wow, we didn't lose that many in World War I. But see, now I have a better perspective because we weren't in it as long as some of these other countries.
Yeah, the airplane changed everything.
Yeah.
If you think about it, war for centuries, more than that, had been a two-dimensional battle. You push your army forward and take some ground, they push you back and take some back, and whoever grabs the most land going back and forth two-dimensionally wins. Which is why trenches became important. You dig a deep trench, you fill it with barbed wire, and it's harder to push your army one way or the other. Airplanes suddenly made it a three-dimensional process. You are up in the air in an airplane, you can see where the trenches are, you can see how many troops are on the other side and where they're positioned. You can drop bombs on them, you can shoot them from guns attached to the airplane. It just totally changed warfare overnight. Keep in mind, September of 1918 is just 15 years after the Wright brothers.
Right. Airplanes
were brand new.
No, I mean, it's amazing what they were able to do. Not just the Wright brothers, but how the technology advanced the way it did. It really was. Skip Desjardin joining us here for the hour on Studio 411. The book, September 18th, War, Plague, and the World Series. And help me out here, the correct pronunciation of your publisher.
Regnery History.
Regnery History, www.regnery, that's REGNERY, regneryhistory.com. All right. Let's see now. Well, we've talked a little bit about baseball, which we'll kind of bob and weave in and out of. We've talked a little bit about the war effort. Now let's talk a little bit about the other effort that was going on, and not as successful as the war effort. I hate to say, for a brief period of time, certainly in the Boston area, and then kind of gradually spread throughout the country as well as the world. The Spanish flu epidemic, or pandemic, I guess would be the correct word. 3% of the world's population died as a result of the pandemic of 1918. Now, again, that is, I believe it was, over 700,000 people worldwide?
700,000 people in the United States.
Oh, the United States.
500 million people worldwide.
Wow.
Spanish flu was a bigger killer than the Black Plague. It's the worst pandemic in human history.
And someone asked me before we went on, and they said, well, what was it? I mean, in layman's terms, what was, first of all, the Spanish flu? I mean, why did they call it that? Because it didn't come from Spain necessarily.
No, it did go all the way through Europe during the early part of 1918, including both sides at the front. But the Allies didn't want to admit that they had a problem with the flu because they figured the Germans might take advantage and spot some weakness. The Germans didn't want to admit that some of their guys had the flu because of the same reasons. Alone among countries in Europe, Spain, which was not on either side in this war remained neutral and therefore did not have press censorship, freely talked about the fact in the media that they had a flu epidemic.
So everybody assumed, it's coming from them because they're the ones that
they're the only ones who admitted
exactly.
that it existed.
Exactly. And to kind of crystallize it in a nutshell from when I was reading the book, the whole, a big crux of the problem, not the pennant race, not how the war effort's going, was the fact that throughout this book, both at a local level, at a federal level, at a worldwide level, which you just crystallized in my mind, no one, I should say the majority, did not want to admit that this was going on.
Yeah, the major theme that runs throughout this book is how the war and the war effort pervaded every single aspect of American life. From little kids who would save up pennies to buy a stamp, which they would put in a book, and once they got enough stamps in the book, they would trade that for a war bond. Because 100 years ago, if America went to war, the government literally borrowed the money from the American people. They didn't put it on a line in a budget and hide it somewhere. They literally borrowed it, spent it, and then later paid the people back. And also kids were collecting peach pits, which I scratched my head at when I first heard about it.
I've heard of the Georgia peach, Thai cow, but
yeah.
peach pits, okay.
So a part of that is because 100 years ago when people ate peaches on the streets, they just threw the pits in the streets. But it turns out that if you collect and then roast, essentially, peach pits, the carbon that results was used to make gas masks.
Okay.
So kids would collect, and there were barrels all over cities all across America to bring your peach pits, and it became this patriotic crusade for kids to see how many they could collect. So every aspect of life, if you were an adult, if you went to a city council meeting, or if you went to the theater, or any kind of lodge meeting or union hall, almost without exception, before the program started, a local citizen stood up and gave a 4-minute speech about the war and why you should support the war and why it was important. These were called 4-minute men. And every week they were given the topic that they should be talking about. It was centralized from the government.
But that was like a real kind of like what would be considered today a modern day PR campaign.
It absolutely was. It was the beginning of public relations as we now know it. And it was designed to drive enthusiasm for the war, to turn the public, which Wilson knew he needed to do, to get them to do a few things. One, loan the government money, which was critically important, and one, be enthusiastic and productive at work. So, because we needed to turn out a bunch of ships and a bunch of rifles and a bunch of blankets and a bunch of guns. And it was important that factories run at peak productivity. So all of this government PR effort was about getting people on board. And it really, you couldn't escape it anywhere in the country. It was illegal 100 years ago for a newspaper to print anything that was critical of the president or critical of the government or could be considered non-patriotic or could be considered to be bad for morale. So on the one hand, here were government officials afraid to tell people how bad the flu really was because, God forbid, they stay home from work and that production goes down. And newspapers were afraid to talk about the flu because editors around the country really did go to prison for printing things that were considered bad for morale. And what could be worse for morale than a giant headline that says, thousands of your neighbors are dying? Yeah,
exactly. So there's a good example of why we need freedom of the press, because of the craziness that the extent to which that was going on. Amazing. Let's go swing back to baseball and the Red Sox for a little bit. One cute story in here I wanted to tell. We didn't have, or they didn't have, I guess, much of a grounds crew. Their ground crew, I guess, consisted of 15 sheep, I read, that grazed the outfield as an early method of trimming the lawn. Okay, so that's a good way. We better not say it too loud because they might bring it back and save a few bucks. But amazing, just amazing. U.S. prices for the 1918 World Series range from $9 to a low of 50 cents for the bleachers. Now, there's a deal. I'm telling you. 50 cents.
And still, they couldn't sell out the games.
For obvious reasons, yes.
Yeah.
Some of the totals, I mean, we're in the teens, maybe 23,000 for one game, and this is when obviously they were shifting to even. Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't they played it not at they played it at Old Comiskey Park? Correct?
Yes.
The home of the White Sox, even though it was the Cubs.
It held more people,
Yeah.
and so they wanted to be able to sell more tickets. And what baseball didn't quite grasp at the time, for reasons that are sort of lost to history. The target audience of people who would buy a ticket and go to the game were either drafted or enlisted or working in a war-related industry somewhere as part of the work or fight rule. All these games were played in the afternoon. Most of them were played on weekdays. So who was going to buy tickets? And attendance was already down by 40% in the 1918 season over the previous year, because there just were not that many men with money and leisure time left to go to the games.
Amazing. They'd be crying a different kind of epidemic now if that happened. It would be a financial epidemic. Speaking of epidemic, unfortunately, on a not so happy note, again, this was either put together afterwards or perhaps by some editor who was willing to perhaps run the risk of going to jail. Boston death record as a result of the epidemic, and you can see during that main stretch from September 14th through October 18th. Again, I'm going to say these are unofficial numbers because you have to wonder if these numbers were even totally correct. But in a roughly 34-day period, you're talking almost 4,000 people in the city of Boston or surrounding areas from either influenza or pneumonia. So again, remarkable.
Yeah. Generally accepted number today is that in the month of September alone, 5,000 people in Boston died of the flu.
Amazing.
By comparison, last year, which was supposedly a pretty bad flu season, 5,800 people caught the flu in the whole state of Massachusetts. And we thought that was a horrible year for the flu.
Exactly, yeah. This is why, if they read this book, they'd be like, wow, you know, and again, even one is too many, but still, compared to this, you mentioned towns that again, I've traveled through or gone to events at, Lynn, Swansea, I mean, you name it, all these well-known towns in Massachusetts, Danvers, that all of a sudden just, you know, the numbers, you know, people in a day, in a week that are dying, and then you might as well bring it up now. You have the thing with the you had a military facility. Was it in Danvers?
Fort Devens.
Fort Devens, okay. And there, I mean, it just, you know, you'd be better off fighting the front.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That was where the flu probably took the greatest toll in Massachusetts. And now you sort of think about it and go, oh, well, of course you had thousands of men packed into little tiny barracks, marching side by side all day long, breathing on each other, coughing on each other. It's a wonder that there weren't more deaths. But at one point in time in September of 1918, there were 10,000 soldiers sick with Spanish flu just at Fort Devens. And out of 20,000 soldiers stationed there, at a base with only about 800 hospital beds and 10,000 sick soldiers.
But even in the city of Boston, didn't you have a thing where there were only, I'm going to say, 20 to 40 beds, or
in some of the smaller hospitals, absolutely,
and,
yeah.
And you were talking in the hundreds, or perhaps even low thousands, that you had people that needed treatment, or that were unfortunately not going to make it.
In the third week of September of 1918, 85,000 people in Boston were sick with the flu. And all the hospitals were closed because they were full. They just couldn't take anybody else. So they closed the doors. There weren't ambulances, there weren't hospital beds, and most significantly, there weren't enough morgues or people to dig graves. There literally weren't enough healthy people to pick up a shovel and dig a grave. And so all over Boston, all over Massachusetts, bodies were stacking up in the middle of September. And at its peak, one person was dying of Spanish flu in Boston every 9 minutes. Can you imagine what life would be like in America today with 24-hour cable news coverage if some disease was running through America that would kill 700,000 people and have people literally falling dead in the streets? It was not uncommon for somebody to get up in the morning, have breakfast, be fine, and be dead by dinner because the flu took its toll that quickly.
You had one story that I wanted to mention. Again, just, there were countless others. Again, there was one gentleman I remember that was, upright 1 minute, and an hour or two later he was dead. And all of a sudden, that's how quick it was. You had a very sad story about a pregnant woman that they had to induce or went into labor early. Well, she dies, and the baby was either stillborn or born but didn't make it. And then what did the nurse do? The nurse put the baby in the mother's arms. Now they're both gone, but and it's I guess then when the father showed up, I can only imagine what his expression or his craziness must have been. He sees this kind of almost angelic image of the mother and the newborn, but they're both gone.
And there were tragic stories like that repeated every day in every town around Massachusetts. One that particularly sticks with me was a visiting nurse going into a home in an Irish neighborhood in Boston and finding a 4-year-old child trying to care for brothers and sisters and parents who were all sick with the flu. And the only person who was able to function was a 4-year-old trying to care for the rest of the family. And that was happening over and over and over again, all across the state.
Turning back to Mr. Wilson and throwing out the first pitch of some season there, but and actually just a little side note, in 1919, I thought it had happened before then. He had suffered a stroke, and there's of course the famous story that not necessarily talked in the book because it was after this, but then where they claimed the wife and one of the people in the government actually were basically running the White House because his illness that struck him was so severe that literally for the remainder of his term, 1.5 years, 2 years at the most, basically he was totally incapacitated, which is one of the reasons why now I believe it's the 25th Amendment would have been enacted to get someone to the next in line to in effect take office, because Wilson himself later, I can only imagine with all these stresses he had, and again, a tough time. I mean, look what it did to Roosevelt, World War II, and so many others. These people assumed so much, on their plate, and ultimately, led to he survived a few years more. But again, I'm sure it took its toll. I wanted to include this shot as an image of again nurses, again at the ready, again not sure how much they could do or whatever, but they did what they're trained and what their calling is for, is to help the sick and try to make make things better.
In many respects, nurses are the great heroes of this book.
I mean, you had doctors, same thing. All of a sudden, doctor, there was one where I think it was at least 2 or 3 in one practice. One died in the morning, the other one was gone by the evening.
Yeah. Again, back to the effect that war had on every part of society. The vast majority of America's doctors were serving in the military. They were either at a military base or they were overseas. And what was left here to care for the civilian population was primarily older doctors. And this was just when medicine was turning and becoming more science than folklore. And so many of those older doctors had never been to med school. They'd sort of self-taught.
Horse doctors.
Yeah. The sort of villain of the book is the head of the city health director in Boston, who day after day would come out and say, nothing to worry about here, this flu is no big deal, go back to work. Had been for 25 years the health director for the city of Washington, D.C., but his background was veterinary medicine.
Right, there you go. I wasn't too far off. We've got a shot here. The Boston Evening Globe. Sox win championship September 11th, so of that year. And just a little side note: U.S. torpedo ship or troop ship rather torpedoed. All on board saved. And then below that, guide for men registering for the draft tomorrow. No offense to the Sox, but you would think that there would be something again now that you've illuminated all of us of why there isn't anything about the pandemic, because of the fact that they were kind of their hands were tied.
And there you go. Registering for the draft. Millions of men had, because they'd opened it up now from 21 all the way down to 18. So all of these men had to go and register. Millions of them showing up in long lines, breathing on each other, and clearly infecting each other right in the middle of the formative days of this epidemic. But the government doesn't want to say, hey, stay home, close the doors, don't come out or you'll get sick,
exactly.
Because they want all those men to show up to register for the draft.
Yep. Again, just so that I think we put everybody on the same page, the plague, the Spanish flu, whatever, influenza, it basically, is it safe to say, came over as a result of some of these soldiers returning, or how do we
eventually
ascertain that, and then of course spread later to places like Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, and I don't know how far, probably out to
everywhere in America.
Everywhere,
eventually, yeah. It started in America.
It did.
A strain of it started in America, and we sent it to Europe.
Okay.
When our troops landed, and then it came back. But the nature of flu, even now, is that it mutates all the time. We all go get a flu shot, and you'll hear the nurse say, well, we hope this is the right dose for you this year. We hope we've identified the right strains, and some years it's more effective than others. And that's because flu is constantly mutating and changing. Even today, with all our advances in medicine, flu is still the 4th or 5th biggest killer of adults every year. It just isn't on this scale. Well, what happened was the particular strain that came back to America in September of 1918 from Europe mutated and became far more dangerous than it had been. Usually when the flu strikes, infants, toddlers, and the elderly are the most at risk. This particular flu killed people in their prime, in their 20s and 30s, because it would get into people's immune system. And the reason they died so quickly was that anytime you get the flu, your system starts to turn out white blood cells to try to fight off that infection. This particular strain made your system go into overtime. So the stronger you were and the more your body had the ability to fight back against an infection, the more likely you were to die, because it just revved itself up to a point where it very quickly filled your lungs with white blood cells and killed you.
Like you talk in the book, literally people, would almost drown, as in the case with pneumonia and whatever. And I remember, not to get off track, but even an episode of MASH from the Korean War days, all of a sudden where they were like saying, well, if we don't do something, they're literally going to dry in their or die in their own fluids.
The irony is that the government and the military were afraid there was going to be an epidemic and planned for it. They had thought that the most likely epidemic would be measles. But throughout the course of human history, more men have always died in times of war of disease than from actually wounds. So they were trying to be prepared. As it happens, the foremost expert in all of America on communicable diseases was stationed at Chelsea Naval Yard in Boston. He was a Harvard professor who literally wrote the textbook about infectious disease. He saw the first patient. He treated the first patient. He knew exactly what he was up against. But as I say in the book, the math overtook the science.
Exactly.
He knew he needed to isolate these first sick people and then isolate the people they had come in contact with. But by the time they came into his clinic, they had already been in touch with too many people who had been in touch with too many people, and the math just exploded.
Gentleman here, Calvin Coolidge. We know him later, Indian headdress, as the famous shot that he took when he was president of the United States some 8 or 9 years after this. Give me a little background. I thought he was from Maine originally, but again, so what was he in the city of Boston or the state of Massachusetts?
Well, to my embarrassment a little bit, when I read the book that caused me to explore this, Dennis Lehane's A Given Day, Calvin Coolidge is also a main character. And he's the governor of Massachusetts at the time. And sort of like you, I said to myself, wait a minute, Calvin Coolidge is from Vermont, isn't he?
Vermont. I thought he was from
How is it
north?
that he's the governor of Massachusetts? And so what I discovered was his entire political career until he became vice president was in Massachusetts. He'd been the Senate president, he was lieutenant governor, he was governor. I had missed all that somehow.
But what was it must have been when he was lieutenant governor, because all I could think of is in this day and age, even before the internet really took hold, the governor was like on a summer holiday or a summer vacation, and this craziness is going on.
It's September. The governor is not running for re-election. The election is in November, so he's lame duck. He's on vacation when all this flu epidemic breaks out. He's just in Canada. He's in Quebec and Nova Scotia, but he calls in and says, you know what, I'll come back if you really need me, but it seems to me like Coolidge can handle this.
Yeah.
And so he puts Calvin Coolidge, who's kind of an unknown, he's the lieutenant governor, kind of a political functionary throughout his career, puts him in charge, and he finds himself running the government in the greatest public health crisis the country's ever known.
These are not Red Sox players, I just want to tell you. These are kind of, I wanted to skip to illuminate a little bit on this, the gas masks, because obviously this is kind of what you had going on in addition to, aircraft and the rise of the airplanes. You had gas warfare going on. One that comes to mind, correct me if I'm wrong, the great pitcher Christy Mathewson for the New York Giants. Okay, he was exposed to that. Now, it didn't kill him, but obviously now I understand he probably didn't get his mask on time or whatever, and many people, died from it, or then suffered things like TB later on, whatever, and his career and his life was shortened considerably because he did serve in World War I.
Well, this is we talked about little kids collecting peach pits in order to make gas masks, and both sides were using chemical warfare during World War I, and it was very common for the troops to be carrying a gas mask and having to put it on, and it turns out, again, one of the connections to Massachusetts, that one of the units in France most affected by gas attacks was the 26th Infantry, the Yankee Division, who was made up almost entirely of Massachusetts, what we would now think of as National Guardsmen. And they had a horrible time with chemical warfare and really badly affecting their casualty numbers.
So even the ones that came back could have had their life expectancy compromised. I believe I read somewhere at that point life expectancy probably was somewhere under 60 years. I mean, 55, 56 years if you were lucky. Obviously, just like any average, someone lives till 80, someone's going to live till 40. So you get that in between. But that really I would think would have made a tremendous impact.
There were a whole variety of different gases used, and some were way more harmful than others. And so in some cases, it took just 2 or 3 minutes of breathing in those gases for your lungs to be permanently damaged.
Sure. I included this. I don't know what I think. From the Virginia State Board of Health. So an example of, again, how this spread across the country slowly. I was going to say follow 2 simple rules. One would have been, in the case of Boston, leave Massachusetts immediately. That would have been rule number 1. Obviously, the governor must have had some insight because he went all the way to Canada. I find that very interesting. I think we need an investigation.
Well, to show you how much times have changed in 100 years. Amongst the hints that the government would give people to try to stay healthy, one was don't wear tight shoes. Not exactly sure where that one came from. One was stop spitting in the street.
Yeah, that runs through the book quite a bit.
Just sort of these crazy ideas as to how the flu was spreading because medicine hadn't quite caught up. Scientists knew for the most part, but the average person didn't.
Got a shot here from the Dayton, I assume it's Dayton, Ohio. Daily News, Armistice signed, and that was, it finally was ratified and settled in around November of 1918.
The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, November 11th, 1918.
There you go. So obviously at that point then, the seeds for World War II were already being sown, because of course then Germany, I believe they call them reparations, paid a huge price, and of course left them to the point where, you know, they were going through their own turmoil financially, morally, whatever, politically, and of course then, you know, what happened later on with the rise of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler. Obviously this all stems from that, but as they say, that's for another episode. So.
Well, but that was part of the conflict between Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge. You know, every once in a while, Lodge would get nervous that Wilson was going to settle the war and reach some kind of peace negotiations. Whereas Lodge's point was, no, we need to beat Germany. We need to decimate Germany so that they never try this again. Well,
one example of that on a smaller scale, some might say scale doesn't matter. What should have been done was the late George H.W. Bush. Went into the Gulf War, and instead of, marched in, whatever, and instead of taking out, Saddam Hussein, kind of didn't, as they say, finish the job. And then, of course, a year and a half, year and 3/4 later, winds up losing the election. So there's an example, kind of more modern day, of the same kind of thing. Get in there, wrap it up, and then, you know what, and let's take care of business.
It's remarkable, as I did the research for this book, and a lot of this ends up in the book, how often you'll read about or hear about something that took place in 1918 and go, wow, that sounds very much like this similar thing that's going on today.
As we said, November of 1918, the Armistice signed, ending World War I. The influenza epidemic that, again, was spreading westward abated in Massachusetts, but, again, continued in other parts of not only the U.S. but abroad. Another important point here, the women's suffrage movement, a shot from that period of time. President Wilson says, this is the time to support women's suffrage. Explain to the viewer again, some of the aspects. Women didn't vote.
Yeah, it's nice to get on to sort of a more uplifting part of September of 1918 and not just death and tragedy.
Well, the Sox did win the championship.
Yes, yeah. Maud Wood Park was a woman from Boston who had been a suffrage leader in Boston and had been very successful in organizing state campaigns around the country to get women the right to vote in state and local elections. But they were still prohibited from voting in federal elections. She went to Washington and almost single-handedly managed to get the Congress to pass the 19th Amendment to the Constitution.
Okay, yes.
I find it remarkable that a woman who couldn't vote herself rallied other women around the country who couldn't vote themselves, and still managed to put tremendous electoral pressure on their representatives in Washington to get this accomplished. The chief opponent with whom she battled head-to-head every day was Henry Cabot Lodge, the senator from Massachusetts, and John Weeks, who was the other senator from Massachusetts. Weeks famously said, I don't care if they hold an election in Massachusetts and every single person in the state votes to give women the right to vote. I don't support it. Well, that probably wasn't a wise thing to say, because in the weeks after September of 1918, women targeted Weeks with letter writing campaigns and rallies and voted him out of office.
I was going to say, imagine now. It wouldn't take a few days to get those letters out. It would be like instantaneous.
On the last day of September, Woodrow Wilson goes to the Senate and makes an impassioned speech in favor of women's suffrage. And the next day a vote is held, and it passes, but not by the 2/3 majority that it needs. So Maud Wood Park, again, this is one of those amazing Boston connections, says, if we can't get enough votes in this Senate, we'll just have to change the senators.
Wow. And again, a woman, I'm sure you would agree, that is, again, totally forgotten about in history. I mean, not only from the women's point of view, but just American history in general. It should be a stamp, a coin, whatever. It's amazing. Well, there's your next book, I think. There's
one of the things that struck me in the course of researching this is that, when I went to school, when my kids went to school, American history was Pilgrims, George Washington, Civil War, World War II, summer vacation. And this period of World War I just totally gets passed over, and we don't study it in school.
I think some of it in reading towards the end of your book, again, it's almost like kind of a post-denial, the country did a bad job of alerting people to it, and then we're just as happy to forget about it, and that's...
Yeah, that's sort of the story of Spanish flu. If you had relatives who lived through this period of time, more than likely, they didn't talk about the flu, they talked about the war. And that fall, particularly if they were focused on that period of time, they talked about how happy they were that the war was over.
Skip Desjardin joining us for the hour here in the remaining moments here on Studio 411. The book, September 18th, War, Plague, and the World Series. Some real short answer points here that unfortunately we could do another hour just on this. Definitely got the feeling that the kind of precursor to what happened with the Black Sox scandal of 1919 was really a lot of dissension among these players throughout the leagues that, of course, were non-unionized. So obviously they didn't have, they didn't have a leg to stand on.
Yeah, we talked about how you read things and you say, hey, that's just like today. Players and owners were fighting about money. What a surprise.
Exactly.
And in fact, the Red Sox and Cubs had a strike in the middle of the World Series and refused to play over how much money they were getting paid. But Boston was absolutely the center of sports gambling, and there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not one or two of the players on the Cubs may have been on the take.
Yes. In writing the book, what subplot, as I call it, did you learn the most about? War, health epidemic of influenza, Spanish flu, or the World Series of 1918?
It was definitely the flu.
Okay.
Again, to put in perspective, when 700,000 people died in this country in one epidemic, when our population was about a quarter of what it is today, that's the equivalent of almost 3 million people died in a year today of one disease. That's just unimaginable to us, and yet it happened, and the fact that we don't talk about it is amazing to me.
And this is why we have the book. This is why a marvelous book. I have a quote here, if I can find it. Of course, oh yes, quote, and yet, already someone was dying in Boston from influenza or resulting pneumonia once every hour, and it was killing them quickly. Men and women who felt fine on Saturday afternoon developed a fever on Saturday night and were dead by Monday. Across the city and its nearest suburbs, people were literally dropping in the streets. Over 36 nurses in Boston had already been infected with the influenza virus. The shortage of nurses, acute before the outbreak, was now even worse. So the guiding lights that I call them of these lovely nurses, in those days predominantly female. I don't think male nurses were around then. They were giving more of themselves. They were giving their lives in many ways.
Absolutely heroic, walking right into the face of this disease and doing everything they could to help people.
As I said, a marvelous book, September 8, 1918, War, Plague, and the World Series. Skip Desjardin joining us for the hour. Again, do you want to give a website or give the publishing website again?
Yeah, people can buy the book online or at their local bookstores, or they can visit my website at september1918.com.
Very good, very good. A pleasure, and we look forward to having you back on. Any other projects in the works?
It took me 7 years to write this book. I'm going to take a bit of a rest before I start another one.
He was doing it on planes, trains, and automobiles, folks, let me tell you. All right, Skip, you hang in there with us. We thank you very much for joining us here on this episode of Studio 411. Larry Dasilva is my name, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.